This is Fox Business. Varney and Company.
Has anyone seen President Obama lately? Apparently members of his own party are looking for him. New York Times opinion columnist Paul Krugman writes, quote, "The president is missing and has been so since 2008 when voters first elected him. He accuses President Obama, along with some others on the left, of not standing for anything and caving to the GOP. And the poll numbers confirm that Professor Krugman is not alone. A new Rasmussen poll says just 37% of liberals strongly approve of the president's performance. That's down from 63% a year ago. Here now to debate that are Kirsten Powers, a New York Post columnist and Fox News contributor, and my good friend and Tea Party Nation founder, Judson Phillips. Judson, to you first, from the Tea Party's point of view, and you know, and Kirsten knows, and the folks watching us know, that I am one of you. Did the president cave, or did Speaker Boehner cave with this $38 billion cut in the 11th hour on Friday night?
John Boehner's freshly laundered white flag of surrender flutters above the Potomac even as we speak today. Obama came away from that as a big winner. I mean, that guy has clearly been taking poker lessons from Harry Reid. They played a bad hand, and they played it to the hilt, and there's no question Boehner and the GOP got their heads handed to them.
All right, Kirsten, if Speaker Boehner and the GOP had their heads handed to them, then what is Paul Krugman and what is Robert Reich and what are other prominent members of the left complaining about today?
Well, I don't think that Boehner had his head handed to him at all, actually. He took the Democrats from wanting zero cuts to up to $40 billion. I mean, that was more than what the Republicans' original request was. So I would say that Boehner actually played the Democrats pretty well. But what Paul Krugman is complaining about, what a lot of Democrats are complaining about, is more about the overall argument, which is that liberals believe, and Obama even had been arguing himself, that we need to be stimulating the economy, not making cuts. And he not only did he give in on the number, but he gave in on the argument. You know, he basically ceded to the Republicans by coming out and saying, hailing this agreement and saying, oh, how great is this? We did all these cuts. And he was agreeing with the Republican narrative. Got
it. Judson, I know you're on the other side of the aisle, so maybe you speak with purity on this, but is the President of the United States in danger of losing his political base? Are Paul Krugman and Robert Reich and folks who agree with them 37% of liberals now approve. That's the lowest he's ever had amongst that group. Is that a threat to Barack Obama's reelection?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, there's another poll I saw today, and I wish I could correctly attribute it. Something like 19% of Americans overall strongly support Obama. So he's got a huge problem here. You know, Obama's been hit with the terrible torpedo of truth, and that is Americans don't like socialism. And that's sort of his default position. But every time he tries to go to that, he realizes, for once, Americans are now seriously worried about the debt crisis. We're looking at $5 a gallon gas. We're upset. The liberals alone are not going to get Barack Obama reelected, and he's losing that base. He's losing the American, the rest of the American people. He's looking at unemployment in 2013.
Right. All right, Kirsten, put aside that we don't know, obviously, who the Republican nominee will be, and no one could know this. But from your point of view in the Democratic Party, as someone who worked in the Clinton administration and has been keenly observing these things for years, is the president in trouble? Did you ever think that a president as liberal as this would be perceived by the left as too centrist or too close to the right?
Well, I just first want to address the socialism comment. You know, if Obama's a socialist, I'm the Queen of England. I mean, it's so ridiculous. I'm so tired of hearing it. He is so far from socialist, which is why the liberals don't like him.
But he does believe in central Kirsten, in central economic planning, whether you want to call that socialism or something else.
Fine. I mean, but he's not he's so far removed from that. It's just so absurd. But
is he in trouble with his base?
No, he's in trouble with his base, but this is why I don't think he's in trouble overall.
Go ahead.
Because A, he has no worthy opponent. B, if you look at the polling on this budget deal, Democrats overwhelmingly supported it. 2/3 of Democrats approved of this deal. So while liberals may be complaining, they're a very small part of the party. And more importantly, independents overwhelmingly approved of this deal.
Got it.
That's what Obama was going for.
Got it. Judson, we got about 30 seconds left. How divided are the Republicans? Are the Tea Party folks that you lead going to challenge John Boehner and Eric Cantor and Kevin McCarthy and the leadership of the Republican Party in primaries next year?
Yeah, well, if I have anything to say about it, I know Boehner's going to have a challenger. I certainly hope a lot of these guys do, because they're not paying attention. This is one thing where we are unified. We're saying stop the spending, no more debt. We're united on this, and Boehner and some of them better listen.
Got it. Judson Phillips, Kirsten Powers, it's a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. The Egyptian army, once the guardian of the revolution, now turning on crowds of peaceful protesters in Tahrir Square. Why the about face and why the killings? Details next. But is the military now trampling over their chance at democracy? A young blogger was just sentenced to 3 years in prison for speaking out against the government, while a deadly assault was launched against pro-democracy protesters this weekend. Joining me now, Colonel Douglas McGregor, author of A Warrior's Rage and a former lifetime career military person himself. Colonel, you surprised that the military in Egypt, which was once considered the liberator of the folks in the street from the despot Hosni Mubarak, is now turning on them?
Well, the short answer, Judge, is absolutely not. The Egyptian army was never the guardian of the revolution. The Egyptian army exists to preserve order in Egypt. They're not going to allow chaos to ensue, and chaos is exactly what will happen if the Egyptian army surrenders control of that country to the various elements who want to overthrow Mubarak's regime, which incidentally is still in power.
All right, let me get this straight, that there are elements in the streets that overthrew Mubarak and the military allowed that to happen, but some of the elements in the streets that want to take over the government are worse than Mubarak, and the military knows that.
Well, of course. Listen, this is true from Morocco to the Red Sea. There will be no liberal democracy in the Arab world. Let's get that straight. The conditions for it don't exist. The culture doesn't support it. There's no rule of law, no respect for private property. Graft, corruption are rampant. These regimes survive on the basis of two things: their ability to pass out cash and benefits to supporters, and their ability to suppress dissent.
Colonel,
that's not going to change.
Colonel, does the President of the United States understand what you just said? And if so, why has he chosen sides in the Libyan civil war?
Well, I think, Judge, we've been down this road before. Libya is not very different from Egypt. In fact, the standard of living in Libya is much higher, and Gaddafi has actually done a better job of improving living standards for his people than was done in Egypt. But the truth is, the president doesn't care. He's an ideologue. He thinks that we can export liberal democracy at gunpoint. We can create instant republics on the Western model anywhere we want. It has never worked. We've been failing at this for decades, and we continue to waste trillions of dollars in American blood on it.
The president is now suggesting that refugees from Libya could fly in military planes to the United States and land at McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey as part of his so-called humanitarian effort to save people. What kind of a national security issue is this going to create?
Well, look, the last thing that we need right now in the United States is to add to the growing underclass and the numbers of people who are already dependent on federal subsidies and government. And that's exactly what would happen. We need to reduce those numbers.
What will it take for us to get out of the Libyan mess that we're involved in?
I think if I were president, I would simply say we've been enormously successful to date and we are leaving. Get out. Disengage as quickly as possible. And it's costing over $100 million a day. We need to get out of Afghanistan and Iraq, too.
All right. Colonel McGregor, it's always a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Judge.
This Friday, a very special show hosted by Glenn in defense of Israel. Set your DVRs now, Friday at 8 p.m. My closing thoughts, next. Does the government work for us, or do we work for the government? What good is a budget deal to cut $38 billion from the president's proposals if it will only put us all deeper into debt? Tonight, the budget, the nature of government, and you. Last week, Washington averted a government shutdown with a midnight deal to spend $38 billion less than the president originally wanted to spend in the next 6 months. This was done the last minute because the Democrats failed to produce a budget for 2011 when they controlled both houses of Congress in 2010. This budget deal came about by the president's view that economic problems generated by too much borrowing and spending can be solved by more borrowing and spending, and the Republican establishment's fear that if they don't redistribute wealth, they might be voted out of office. To paraphrase Macbeth, this is a tale told by idiots, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Does anyone around Washington understand basic economics? Can anyone in Washington tell the truth? The truth is the president will need to borrow another $1 trillion in order to spend what both parties have just agreed to let him spend. So calling the $38 billion reduction off of $1 trillion in red ink a victory for fiscal conservatism or for small government just doesn't make any sense. It is a cut from what the president wanted to spend. It still enables him to spend $1 trillion more than the government receives in revenue. That's where basic economics comes in. America, you may be tired of hearing this, but your government owes $14.3 trillion because president's now dead and Congress is now long out of office, borrowed against the future, and those bills are now due. They are now due because with economic times difficult, the tax base is shrinking, and taxpayers can only afford so much in taxes before the government ruins them, and the government can only afford so much in payments in interest on the debt before we all become enslaved to those from whom the dead presidents and the out-of-office Congresses have borrowed all this money. If most Republicans agree with what I just said, and they claim that they do, how can they possibly agree that we can now borrow another $1 trillion in just the next 6 months? If we haven't the money or the means to pay back so much as $1 of the $14.3 trillion we owe, how can we morally borrow another $1 trillion? There was a time when the two political parties stood for different values, but their thirst for power and their enjoyment in exercising it, what St. Augustine called the lust to dominate, has brought these two parties into a collaborative arrangement whereby they pretend to do battle over values. In reality, they accept the same principles, such as the need for war, the desirability of central economic planning, the indispensability of debt, and the wisdom of transferring wealth in order to buy votes. This is indeed a sad state of affairs that leadership in both parties accept these views so antithetical to those of the framers, views so socialistic in nature, views so violative of your natural right to do as you wish with your earnings and your property, views so utterly calculated to deliver us to economic doom as to be called un-American at their core and to constitute a government based in legalized theft. What shall we do? We should encourage every Republican in Congress and the few Democrats who will listen to vote against the president's proposals to allow him to borrow the $1 trillion this year and the $1.7 trillion he wants to borrow next year. Those votes have yet to be taken, and there is still a chance the borrowing could stop. And we should force the government, just like we do at home, to live within its means. And if it doesn't, then we should in due time replace it with a government that means what it says when it swears fidelity to the Constitution. Because the majority of these folks in power now don't. From New York, defending freedom. So long, America.